Clara walked through the glass-walled offices of her firm with the practiced grace of a woman who owned every inch of the floor. As a senior architect, her name was synonymous with modern elegance and structural integrity. To the outside world, she was the embodiment of success, a thriving career, a beautiful home, and a legacy that stretched through generations, the urban landscape she had helped shape. Yet, beneath the sharp lines of her tailored blazers, a devastating fracture was forming. She was a master of building structures that could withstand the elements, yet her own internal scaffolding was beginning to creak under invisible weight. The shadow first emerged during the most critical board meeting of the year. The room was cold, smelling of mahogany. As Clara stood to present the blueprints for the new library, the world suddenly tilted. The air vanished, replaced by a suffocating vacuum. Her heart became a frantic bird in a cage of ribs, beating with a violence that made her dizzy. Sweat pooled at the base of her spine, though she remained outwardly frozen. To her colleagues, she appeared to be pausing for effect. But inside, Clara was drowning. The words on the slides blurred into illegible streaks. She felt a primal urge to bolt. Yet she forced her hand to click the next slide, her fingers trembling so violently she had to hide them beneath the podium. This wasn't just about a job. It was about the crushing weight of her family's prestigious reputation. For decades, the women in her family had been pillars of strength who never faltered. To admit to this terror was to admit to a weakness that she feared would dismantle her legacy. She believed that if she cracked, her entire life would come crashing down. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. This secret became a wall between Clara and her husband. Her partner, once her anchor, now felt like a stranger. When they sat for dinner, she would pick at her food, her mind racing with the what-ifs of her next attack. When he reached for her hand, she would find an excuse to leave the room. Terrified, he would feel the frantic pulse in her wrist or see the fear in her eyes. The silence in their home grew heavy, a shroud of shame she refused to lift. She could build skyscrapers, yet she couldn't bridge the gap to the man she loved. She was retreating into a shell of silence, convinced her struggle was a solitary cross to bear. One Tuesday evening, the pressure reached its zenith. Clara retreated to her office, a sanctuary of sketches. But tonight, the walls felt like they were closing in. The ceiling seemed to descend, and the shadows morphed into predatory shapes. She collapsed into her chair, gasping for air that felt thin as mist. Her vision narrowed to a vibrating pinprick. In a moment of total despair, she began rummaging through a box of old keepsakes, hoping to find a fragment of a memory to anchor her soul. Her hands landed on a heavy, leather-bound volume, her late grandmother's Bible. As she opened the worn pages, an old prayer card fluttered out. The edges were yellowed and frayed. On the front was an image of a young woman with a crown and a sword, her expression one of profound peace. It was Saint Dymphna. Clara remembered her grandmother mentioning the saint as a light for those whose minds were troubled by unseen storms. With trembling fingers, Clara brought the card to her eyes. The air in the room felt unnaturally still. She cleared her throat, her voice a mere rasp. Just as she began to read the first line of the prayer, the power suddenly cut out. The room was plunged into total, complete darkness. In the sudden silence, a soft, rhythmic whisper brushed against the back of her neck. A voice, not her own. The darkness in the room felt heavy, but the whisper lingered like a draught under a door, chilling Clara to her marrow. She gripped the yellowed prayer card of Saint Dymphna, her heart still hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. In the flicker of a match, she struck to light a small candle. The story of the young woman on the card began to fill her mind, a tale passed down in fragments from her grandmother. Dymphna was an Irish princess from the 7th century. A girl who had fled the madness of her own father, a king consumed by grief and mental instability. She had crossed the vast grey seas to find refuge, eventually becoming a martyr and a beacon for those whose minds were battlefields. Clara, a woman who prided herself on logic and structural integrity, felt a strange magnetic pull toward this ancient tragedy. It was the story of a girl who stood firm when the world around her lost its reason. And for the first time, Clara felt she wasn't alone in her internal chaos. Yet, the modern Clara fought against the comfort of the card. She was an architect. She believed in things that could be measured, weighed, and balanced. She believed in steel beams and reinforced concrete, not in miracles or the intercession of a saint who lived over 1,000 years ago. To her analytical mind, turning to prayer felt like an admission of defeat, a regression into superstition because she couldn't control the chemical and electrical storms in her own brain. The spiritual desperation she felt was a raw, gaping wound that her intellect couldn't stitch shut. She felt like a fraud, a builder who couldn't even keep her own foundations from crumbling, and the shame of that perceived weakness burned hotter than the panic itself. She had already tried everything the modern world offered. Her nightstand was a miniature pharmacy of beta blockers and pills designed to numb the edges of her reality. She spent her lunch hours in a sterile beige therapy office, dissecting her childhood and her relentless drive for perfection. While the medication blunted the sharpest spikes of her heart rate, it left her feeling like she was walking through a thick, grey fog. The therapy explained the why of her condition, but it failed to provide the how for surviving the terrifying now. There was a hollow space in her chest, a spiritual void that clinical explanations simply couldn't reach. It was a hunger for a peace that didn't come in a bottle, a sanctuary that a doctor's note couldn't provide. The stakes were rising as the days blurred into a haze of high-functioning anxiety. A few days later, during a site visit at a skyscraper under construction, Clara stood on a high scaffolding overlooking the bustling city. Suddenly, the heights she had always loved turned into a spinning, malevolent vortex. The wind seemed to scream her name, and her knees buckled. She had to lean her entire weight against a cold steel girder to keep from falling as her vision tunneled. A junior architect nearby asked if she was all right, and Clara snapped a sharp, cold response to mask her terror. She was barely holding on to the mask of the successful professional. Each day was a performance, a high-wire act where the wind was picking up, and she could feel the safety net fraying beneath her. Driven by a primal survival instinct rather than true faith, Clara began a nightly ritual. When the house was quiet and her husband was asleep on the other side of their emotional divide, she would sit by the window with the prayer card. She didn't believe the words at first. She whispered them like a mantra, a rhythmic anchor to stop the room from spinning. "O blessed Saint Dymphna, patron of those afflicted with mental and emotional illness, hear my plea." The words felt heavy and foreign on her tongue. It wasn't a prayer yet. It was a drowning woman clutching a piece of wood in a storm. But as the nights passed, something subtle began to shift. The crushing weight on her chest didn't magically vanish, but it felt less like lead and more like a challenge she could finally carry. A strange, quiet peace, one that surpassed her logical understanding, began to seep through the cracks of her armor. For the first time in months, she took a full, deep breath that reached the very bottom of her lungs. It was as if the saint was standing guard at the perimeter of her mind, holding back the shadows just enough for her to see the light of the moon outside her window. This fragile peace was about to be tested to its absolute limit. The date for the grand presentation of the library project, the career-defining moment her entire family legacy depended on, was finally set. Clara was in her office, refining the final blueprints, when her phone buzzed on the mahogany desk. It was an encrypted message from an unknown number. "The perfect Clara isn't so perfect after all," the message read. Attached was a grainy photo of her gasping for air in her car during a private breakdown weeks ago, her face twisted in a mask of pure, raw agony. Everyone loves a hero, but no one trusts a glass pillar about to shatter. I wonder what the board would think if they saw the real you. Clara felt the cold hand of dread wrap around her throat once more. Someone knew her secret, and they were ready to destroy everything she had built. The morning sun felt like a harsh, unforgiving spotlight on a crime scene as Clara walked into the grand auditorium for the municipal library project. Every clicking sound of her heels against the cold marble floor echoed the threat of the anonymous blackmailer, a rhythmic reminder that the secret she had guarded so fiercely was no longer hers alone. She saw the faces of the board members, hard, expectant, and steeped in a corporate tradition of absolute perfection. The anonymous message haunted her vision, the grainy, stolen image of her own vulnerability mocking her from the glowing screen of her phone. She stood behind the heavy mahogany lectern, the blueprints for the landmark library spread before her like a map of a world she no longer felt she belonged to. As the chairman, a man of iron and little patience, gestured for her to begin, the familiar, terrifying tightening began in her chest. The air in the cavernous hall turned to liquid lead, and the faces in the front row began to blur into a terrifying mosaic of silent judgment. The panic didn't arrive as a mere whisper this time. It surged like a tidal wave, threatening to sweep away decades of professional poise and family pride. Her vision tunneled until all she could see were the harsh fluorescent lights reflecting off the white blueprints. Her pulse was a frantic drumbeat of failure in her ears, and the ground felt as though it were tilting toward a dark abyss. She felt the desperate urge to turn and run, to disappear into the crowded city and never look back at the life she had built. But then she felt the slight and comforting weight of the yellowed prayer card tucked into her blazer pocket, resting directly against her racing heart. She closed her eyes for a moment longer than a simple blink, a heavy silence falling over the expectant room. In that internal darkness, she reached out for the sacred words she had practiced in the quiet, lonely hours of the night. "O blessed Saint Dymphna," she whispered in the cathedral of her mind, "you who stood firm when your own world turned to madness, grant me the strength to stand now." She visualized the saint's ancient, steady gaze, a shield of soft light forming between her spirit and the suffocating shadows. The terror didn't magically vanish, but it underwent a profound and sudden transformation. It was no longer a monster trying to drown her. It was a piercing clarity that burned away her remaining pretenses. Opening her eyes, Clara looked at the prestigious audience and slowly pushed the technical script aside. She began to speak, but the words weren't about the load-bearing capacity of steel or the aesthetic symmetry of the facade. Instead, she spoke about the necessity of light, the vital importance of quiet spaces, and the deep human need for a sanctuary where the mind can finally find rest from its own storms. Then, with a voice that didn't tremble, she shared the raw truth. She told the room that she had designed this refuge while fighting a desperate war within herself. She publicly acknowledged her panic attacks and the weight of her expectations, turning her supposed weakness into a bridge of shared experience. She caught sight of the blackmailer in the third row, a disgruntled former associate, his face turning a sickly pale as his leverage evaporated into the open air. By owning her struggle, Clara had rendered his weapon completely useless. The room, which she had expected to be filled with scorn, was instead heavy with a resonant silence that felt like a collective breath being held. People weren't looking at her as a glass pillar about to shatter. They were looking at her as a person who had finally found the rare courage to be whole. She realized that the architecture of her soul was just as important as the building she designed for the city skyline. The aftermath was not the ruin she had feared, but a grand liberation. The board approved the design with a standing ovation, moved by the humanity Clara had infused into the project. More importantly, the thick wall of silence between her and her husband finally crumbled that evening. In the soft glow of their living room, she showed him the prayer card and shared the bruises on her soul she had hidden for so long. He didn't turn away. He held her with a depth of understanding she hadn't dared to hope for, finally becoming the pillar of support she needed. Clara continued her career with a new perspective, no longer viewing her mind as a battlefield, but as a garden that required tending. Every morning, she spent time in reflection with Saint Dymphna, maintaining a sacred balance between her ambition and her peace. Her story became a beacon for others, a reminder that vulnerability is not a structural flaw, but the very thing that makes a life resilient. For anyone feeling the walls close in, she knew now that hope is never further away than an honest breath and a prayer for the light. May the peace of Saint Dymphna find you in your darkest hour.